Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here and follow the inspirational speaker and author that is John Alexander. I'm not feeling any pressure whatsoever. Yeah, I'm 5 years deep into my PhD, hopefully, optimistically 18 months or 2 years to go. I spend most of my weekends and spare time trying to interpret academic research and terminology. So ChatGPT is my best friend. Why they don't write it simply, I don't know. And I'm here today because when you're doing a doctorate, you become a real bore. And if anybody will listen to anything that you've got to say about your research, you chew their ear off. And unfortunately for Michael, he has been very receptive to research papers that I've read and sent to him and said, oh, I've read this, I think this might be really interesting. And the last one that I sent to him was linked to community and to the link between community, local governance and trust boards by a lady called Jacqueline Baxter. And Michael invited me to come and talk about some of my findings as a result of that. Noticeably, Michael has stopped replying to my emails recently, so maybe he's had his fill of my doctoral research. So, what does the research tell us? Well, perhaps not unsurprisingly, there isn't a plethora of research about maths because they're relatively new organisational forms. Sort of 2010, we got a real surge of academics. So there is literature out there, but it's fairly limited. And similarly, there's very little around the role of CEOs, which is the work I'm interested in. It tends to focus on the technical, structural and governance issues linked to maths rather than the lived experiences of CEOs, which I think is a really important area to explore. It's also really helpful that it's under-researched because that's one of the prerequisites of doing a doctorate. So the research tells us, and lots of things that you will all know, that maths aren't a homogenous group. And actually, the role of the CEO cannot be singularly defined, because multi-academy trusts cross lots of different socio-demographics. They're of different sizes, there are different phases, different age ranges, they're mixed, they might be special, they might serve urban communities, they might cover a wide geographical spread, so that you're dealing with multiple geographical and demographical communities. And also their histories and how they've emerged are quite different. So we've perhaps had early maths where it was from an original collaborative partnership that has evolved and been formalised. We've got other maths that are full of schools that have been sponsored. So we've had backgrounds and histories where there's been a fragility to those schools. And that's all quite important because it's really important about how we address and how we develop and define culture in our organisations. But also, if we're really serious about engaging with our community and approaching things from a citizen perspective, then we have to deeply understand and acknowledge those differences in those communities. Otherwise, we're trying to implement things in a group that's not homogenous. Now, interesting, as all of you will know, it's not that there isn't community knowledge. It's not that children don't feel that they belong or don't belong. It's not that parents don't see the barriers or experience the barriers. It's not that our local communities aren't fully aware of their own histories and their own individual challenges. That knowledge is there. The problem is that that knowledge doesn't translate up to trust boards. So we've moved from a model of local authorities and local governing bodies, where actually they were democratically elected. There was representation that was democratic. Actually, trust boards aren't democratically elected, so the position has changed. So why is that? So why is it that in schools and organisations where there's lots of brilliant people like you who are all driven by an intense moral purpose and know about the demands of the community, why is it that that information doesn't travel upwards? So I'm going to draw on John's work here, and I really enjoyed your book. Thank you very much. I'm going to digress a little bit now. My vision is terrible, and I spend most of my time reading academic research. So whenever I'm listening to a fiction book, I do it when I'm walking the dog. but I wanted to read John's book, so I had to put it on my Audible. Unfortunately for me, when I'm walking the dog halfway around, he says something, and I have to stop and take a voice note, much to the amusement of the several people who are walking towards me. But anyway, I digress. So John talks about the consumer story and the subject story. And I think my provocation is that actually, without doubt, the sector has moved to the consumer story. So as a result of neoliberal reform, we've got market forces, competition, choice, and I use that in inverted commas. And actually, we've got a system where there's parent choice, there's competition, there's league tables. So we sit in a system that's linked to the consumer story. However, I argue that as organisation, as leaders, we are still functioning within the subject story. And the reason for that is performativity. So high accountability, audit and surveillance through inspection, external audit, etc., etc. It's such a high-stakes system that actually what happens is that we start to play within the rules of the game that are set. So whilst we want to work in a place that sits more within the consumer story, we still lean towards being the subjects, done to, slightly passive. So that's sort of my provocation. We start to play by the rules of the game. And I understand that. You know, I live and breathe, as you do, the pressures of that. But actually, we're not quite, we perhaps slide between the two. So again, this notion of moving to the citizen story really resonates with me. The result of that is that we start to see power and authority increasingly centralised. So we create centralised systems to create security. I get that. We create coherence. Can help create alignment. It can make sure that we can manage risk more effectively. But the challenge of centralisation is actually if we start to move decision-making increasingly away from the lived experience of those in our schools, in our communities, that becomes damaging. We stop being quite so curious. We stop being quite so innovative. We just play safely by the rules of the game. And there's a bit of a disclaimer here. And my research is looking at through a framework of a French psychologist called Pierre Bourdieu. And he talks about fields. So society essentially works in these fields of social activity. So we work in the educational field, but you also work in the field that is your mat, or the social field. And although across the research it's really clear that CEO motivation is largely moral purpose, comes through very strongly, there are, as I'm sure you're aware, other motivations that are also very clear in the literature that are less driven by altruism and moral purpose. So we all start at that point, but the field logics in the education sector are around performance, outcomes, and efficiency. And the longer that we spend in that field, we want to try and acquire power and influence. And so we gain capital as we get along. So we want to try and gain economic capital, so resource and finance to be sustainable, linked to growth or roles that we do. We want to gain symbolic capital, so we want to be seen as legitimate and credible and have influence. And we want to gain social capital, so be in the right networks. We're in a network here, so we're gaining social capital with our interactions. And the reason for that is that that gives you a degree of influence in the field that you work. Now, the challenge is that over time, we start to internalise the rules of the game in the system. So although we may not think, for example, we don't believe in exclusion, we also can see the impact of disruption or behaviour on learning of others, and so it becomes acceptable. So the result is that although we start with a really strong set of moral purpose and values, we internalise the rules of the game, because we have to survive and gain influence. And then so the very system that we've come into that we're sort of trying to change, we start to reproduce. So it's not that we all deliberately just forget everything we believe in, it's that we know that we've got to navigate between the two. And all of you will live and breathe that as I do. Again, the challenge of this is that what happens is that we start to develop systems that are system-led values, not values-led systems. So the systems come first and our values follow. Where if we put our values first and designed our systems around that perhaps things had changed. So I think about that a lot when we're trying to gather stakeholder view. I bet we'll all do a questionnaire, and we love it now because we've got Google Forms, and I can get all of those, 500 parents to do me a return. But the reality is they don't. But I've created a system that is convenient and means that my governance lead can say, we've done that, yeah. And actually, what does it tell me? Nothing. Whereas actually, perhaps the thing I need to create is something that's values-led that says, actually, you know what? I need to sit in a room and talk to some parents or listen to some parents, not talk to them. So be mindful of, are your systems values-led or are your values system-led? I could get myself in a mess with that one, couldn't I? And the second thing is whose voice is heard and whose voice is valued. So again, all of us will have mechanisms for trying to capture pupil voice, staff voice, stakeholder view, engage with the community. And lots of us will gather that information. But the challenge of that is that information valued, and valued by who? So does that information get distilled and lose its richness? And do we lose the narrative of the community? Because actually we translate it into KPIs or measures or a graph or data that then the board digest, if the board indeed get that information. So who's heard, and how do we create mechanisms for that? And then do we value the information that we receive? Because actually, we only have influence if we're heard and something changes as a result of that. It's not about do we consult on a decision that's been made, it's about engaging with others to help shape a decision, to tell us what they need. Interesting, the research says that between 60 and 70% of MATs do have some form of local governing body. But also it says that the majority of those local governing bodies feel that it's tokenistic. I have it in my trust. My LGBs have limited delegated responsibility around finance, etc. Their role is around engaging in stakeholder view and community work. But the research is telling us that actually they feel like it's a little bit tokenistic. Are all our schools and all our school communities, are we really getting representation from parents who have really experienced and have got the lived experience of those communities? Or are we engaging with them who feel confident enough to come to a local governing body? Same with trust boards. All our trust boards have become very corporatised, so actually parents don't feel that they belong in that. That's not the place for them, but it's so important that we get that representation. So, just reflect on your own mats. Where have you got the most vocal LGBs? I've just got one in my head. And where are you least able to recruit? And why is that? And does it need to be all formal? Or should it just be, just said to Nikki, a knit and natter? Because actually that's where I'm going to find out about that community. This is a slide that I sort of live and die by. And I kind of tried to map John's work, sort of linked to that around, for me, Citizen is working with, and this is something we use across our trust all the time, and I was introduced by the great Mark Finnis. It's actually the social discipline window, but we use it for a lot of our decision making and our conversations, the way we work. And you're always going to move, hopefully you're not going to end in the not box, but you're always going to move between the two. Sometimes it's right to do 2, sometimes it's right to do 4, but we predominantly want to work in the with box, working with high challenge, high support, It's really easy for people in the community to fall into the not box. They just become passive recipients of what schools do. Because you're a teacher, you're a head teacher, you know best, you'll tell me what the parental contract's going to be. So we're always trying to remain in the with box. Now the problem with the with box is it's messy and it's slow and it's not convenient and it's really hard to get consistency and coherence. But I really challenge maths around standardisation, and I think we should be wrangling with it. Carl Weck's work on tight and loose coupling in organisations. Tight coupling is great, you get us to a certain point, and there will be times in your schools and organisations where you need to be tight. But the problem with tight coupling is that you can't be adaptive, you lose innovation. And in a time where more than ever we need creative thinking and innovative ideas, maybe it's time to let the helium balloons go a little bit. And I'm passionate about this, and a big thread of my doctorate is around culture. And consistently through the literature, and there's a real split in the literature that exists about CEOs. Some is quite critical in terms of it sees us as actors of neoliberal reform, and the other is a bit more functional and actually looks at the role. But what is a common thread is that we need to move beyond the technical. So technical solutions and systems aren't the thing that's going to move us forward. And actually we've been encouraged to develop technical systems and solutions. Well, actually it's the relational skills. It's about relationships. It always is, isn't it? So it's how we make people feel, how we allow people to fail safely, how do we trust, how transparent are we? So I say time and time again, and I'm sure you will all live and breathe it, the hard days at work aren't because I've had to build a data dashboard or do some report analysis. It's the people side, isn't it? How do I navigate this conversation? How do I say, no, you can't have that extra member of staff, even though the head teacher in me is like, oh, God. You know, I would have been a terrible trust head teacher, I think. So the culture is king, and relationships, and I think we must always hold on to that. And so the three things that I kind of think about, you know, so what do we do? If we're serious about moving to a place of community-based leadership and citizenship, then we need to intentionally listen. We need to be intentional about how we create opportunities to listen, and we need to listen with intent. We then need to value what we've heard. Because if we just listen but nothing changes and nothing happens, then what's the point? So we must intentionally make opportunities to listen. We must listen with intent. We must value what we've heard and not try and distill it or make it fit our narrative. And then we must act. And I think, again, it's always difficult, isn't it? Because John, I think, said it, or Steve. We are bridging between two very different sort of ideologies, two very different logics, sort of an educative logic and a business and efficiency logic. And all the time there is a tension pulling us between the two. But no one is going to do this for us. And if we sit and wait, we'll be waiting a long time. And it doesn't mean that there's got to be some big revolution. Oh, I'm a Scouser, so I'll have a banner in a fight, so I'm up for that. Small things can make a difference. So just those mechanisms of how do we really listen, and how do we make time to listen to those who aren't the most vulnerable, those who actually aren't confident enough to speak or don't feel they've got a voice. Or how do we go back and reflect on, well, what do we report on? What do we value as an organisation? And what do I report to my trust board? Because somebody else is asking me all the time for all the other stuff around performance data and finance. So I think we've got to be brave. And even if we're brave in a small way, perhaps that takes us to the point of change. And if not us, who? So thank you for listening. Yeah.